Hi, I'm Danny. I'm a wildlife photographer. And today I'm going to break down some of my favourite shots. This clip basically kickstarted everything for me on social media. This is a video clip of a baby squirrel squeaking. I posted this video and within an hour it got 1 million views, and by the end of the day it got 16 million views, and it actually got the attention of a sound designer. His name is Mark Mangini, and he wanted this sound in Dune.
There was a certain expressiveness to it that we couldn't find in any other animal recordings that we had.
If you watch Dune, Muad Dib, who is the desert mouse, is this squeaking squirrel. The reason I'm so close to this baby squirrel is because I was actually photographing its mother a lot, and she got hit by a car. I knew she was pregnant, and I thought all her baby squirrels had died somewhere. And a few days later, I went to the forest and I saw this tiny orange thing running around me. Turns out they had survived, and I basically spent every day for 6 weeks in the forest providing these baby squirrels with food: apple, pear, seeds, nuts. They basically were dependent on me. As a wildlife photographer, I'm trying to document wildlife or the animals as they are. I don't want to intervene or interrupt, but in this situation, I felt that I had a responsibility to intervene because human had already impacted their ability to survive, and so that's why I was sort of there helping. They still were in the wild, so predators could still get involved, but I did help for that time until they were old enough that they could feed on their own. And I'm pretty sure I still see this guy. His name is Buddy now, 4 years on. This next shot was my most recent project. It actually took 2 years to get these shots, and every time I see it, it's just so adorable. Basically, what I did was create an artificial nest. I had my camera inside, so I had this artificial box and I had a shelf. So the squirrels would sleep here, and they've got an entrance in and out, and in this separate shelf, I have my camera and the lens is shooting directly down at the squirrels. I've also got another shelf here, and this is like frosted acrylic, and I've got a small LED strip with only 4 LEDs, so it's quite poorly lit, but lit enough that my camera can take photos and videos. I then had another box here, and this box has a mini computer, and this basically allows me to control my camera. So I used software called EOS Utility, which is a Canon software. It means I can control my ISO, my shutter speed on a computer. And this box also provides the electricity for the LED lights and for my camera. And in this box, I also have a mini router with a SIM card. And then this little box has a 12-meter cable where I'm feeding everything with electricity. And then off-site, I've got either my phone or my laptop, and I'm basically controlling the other computer, which is controlling my camera. So that means I can be anywhere in the world. I can be at home or traveling and taking photos and videos of these squirrels sleeping. In order to do this ethically, I'm obviously trying to photograph and film them sleeping naturally, and I cannot be there and disturb them. The only time I can change settings or anything with the camera is when they leave. So I would wait, and when they leave, I would come quickly change card, or if I need to change some settings, and then I would need to get out quickly. Since inside the box it's quite poorly lit, I had to shoot at quite a wide aperture. So I was shooting at f2.8 always. My ISO was actually quite high. For video, it was probably around 1600. For photos, maybe even like 4000, because it is quite dark in here. They're not moving, so that means I could have a very low shutter speed. So for video, it was probably 1/30th of a second, and then for photos, probably 1/60th, around that. For wildlife, I'm usually trying to shoot at 60 frames a second, sometimes even 120 frames a second, which is slow motion. But for this, it was what I needed. Most of the time, the baby squirrels weren't even in shot. They would either go under the lichen and bury themselves in all the vegetation, or they would be like right in the corner, and they always like to sleep on top of each other, so you can't quite tell. But we've got one squirrel, two squirrel, and then underneath there's another squirrel, so there's actually three in this shot. And trying to get at least two faces was quite tricky because they would just literally sleep on top of each other. I probably spent 3-4 solid nights watching my camera, and I had 2 screens so I could actually work and do other things, and then I was constantly watching them for 4 days. So if I went for a shower, I had my phone and I was watching them, because the moments that they actually show their face was maybe a minute within the whole night, and I can't miss that opportunity. The next stage of this project is that I actually want to film and document a mother squirrel giving birth and raising her kits in this artificial box, and maybe I can do that next year. Bye! This next shot was from earlier this year. We were going to have the coldest day in northern Sweden. It was going to be minus 37 Celsius. I've never experienced that kind of cold. And so I went to a golden eagle hide. And a hide is basically like a sheltered cabin or a tent, and you stick your lens out of a hole, and you basically just wait for hours until the wildlife appears. Sometimes it doesn't. In winter, sun sets around 1:30, and this was probably taken around 2 p.m. And so the light is already quite dark. And what was quite nice is that the sun had set from this direction, and in the background you have some pine trees which are in the dark. And this is great because that means you can actually see the snow, because sometimes if you have a very bright background you can't actually see the snow. So it's great to have a light source between your subject and the background, so you can actually see snow and rain. So for this shot I was actually shooting at f2.8 with this lens. This is my probably most used lens at the moment, and for wildlife photography you don't necessarily need the longest lens. This is 400 f2.8. So the main reason I like it is because I can shoot at f2.8, and this is particularly good for a dark forest or poorly lit situations. But I do also use a zoom lens, which is more manageable, less heavy. And the great thing about a zoom lens is that you can zoom, and especially for video and for photography, you often want to get a variety of shots, and especially when you're trying to show a story, it's really important to sometimes zoom out and show more of the environment, or to zoom in and focus on something specific like the eye or the feathers. So in this situation, I could zoom in and focus on the amazing ice that formed around the eagle's eyes. For this clip, I was actually shooting at 120 frames per second. And even though that is not favorable for the poor light. I really wanted to get the movement of the snowflakes. And when you're shooting at such a slow frame rate, sometimes you pick up quite interesting things. And in this clip, I actually picked up the moment of the third eyelid. It's when it comes over the eagle's eyes and it's very blue. And if I was shooting at 60 frames a second or even 24 frames a second, you probably wouldn't have been able to capture that so well. But sometimes I'm in the forest at minus 15, minus 20 Celsius. And especially when I'm trying to photograph squirrels, I need to sit on the ground, be still and not move. And that's when it can be really tough. You have to be patient, you have to be still, you have to be quiet. And sometimes it can be very boring and uncomfortable. I sometimes will look up my phone, but I try not to, because when you're alert and aware, you will start to hear how the forest sounds, and that can impact your photography a lot. Next one. So this was a really fun location. These are puffins fighting. For this, I was shooting at 120 frames a second. Puffins are birds that only come to land in the summer to nest, and they will lay an egg and raise their chicks, and they spend the whole winter in the Atlantic, in the sea. But what's quite unique about this location is that because it's so far north, there's still snow in spring when the puffins arrive. So there's only a few weeks where you actually get puffins arriving and the end of winter, basically. So when I arrived at this location, I spent maybe an hour or two just trying to understand how the animals use the landscape. And I discovered that there was this valley, and the puffins would basically come down it. They would either walk or fly, and then they would go this direction to go into the sea and feed. And so I was sat here, and I knew that in this area they would potentially fight. And this is when they would roll down the hill. This was also the best location for photos and videos because the snow was actually melting, and in the other areas you could see patches of rock. And I wanted this clean white background, and this slope was the best location. And so I would basically just wait, and I had my camera set up for slow motion or for photos with a high frame rate. And I had subject tracking on. I had animal tracking for puffins because they have such small, beady little eyes. I couldn't use the eye tracking, but I often do use that. Because they were also fighting and the eyes might be covered by a wing, I wouldn't use it in this situation anyway. I often don't use a tripod for wildlife because I need to be ready in all sorts of different situations. Maybe birds are flying or coming towards me. And so because my lens is quite heavy and I'm shooting at 120 frames a second and I've got image stabilization in my camera and my lens, I can actually get quite a stable shot even though I am handheld. So this is generally how I use my camera. And my left arm is considerably stronger than my right arm because of this. And I've been doing wildlife photography now for 15 years, so there is a bit of a difference. But this is how I would hold my camera. Often I see a lot of people holding their lens like this, but you can't be stable like this. So it's better to have the hand like this. And if I do pause my focus and go onto manual, I can do that here. And then with this hand, I'm pretty free to change different settings, to take photos. Being eye level is definitely favorable for animals because it's more intimate. You're more immersed into their world. And I'm always on my knees or on my stomach filming wildlife. The reason I know about wildlife and animals and how they behave is I actually studied zoology at university, and before that viral squeaking squirrel, I was going to do a PhD in tropical ecology. So that video literally changed my whole course of life. And I thought I would be a science nerd and study these animals. But now I photograph them, so it's pretty fun. Oh, I moved it. There we go. Earlier this year, I actually went to Patagonia to photograph pumas in the wild, and it was crazy. I often get asked, like, how close are you actually to the wildlife? And I was probably like 15 meters away from the pumas. In this location, which is Torres del Paine National Park, they have removed all hunting of pumas a long time ago, and so now the pumas are completely unbothered by people. So they will walk through campsites and walk in front of people. But trying to find a puma is not that easy. So I actually hired a puma guide, and we would basically go on like safari drives almost. We would drive at sunrise and sunset for several hours looking for pumas. This was actually our last session, and it was absolutely amazing. We went to a hotel grounds, and the pumas were just sleeping basically next to a hiking trail. And we waited for hours for the young puma, this one actually. So this is the male cub, and his mother is behind. So for this, I was actually shooting at 120 frames per second. And I actually use different frame rates all the time. So generally for wildlife, I'm always shooting at 60. That's the minimum. And if there's something quite interesting happening, or there's movement, like these pumas are walking, I want to capture their muscles moving. And maybe if they do something like they yawn, I'll use 120 in those situations. But if I was constantly shooting at 120, I would fill up cards very quickly. So it's favorable to shoot at 60. And then environmental shots or vlogs of myself talking about what I'm doing or where I am, I will be shooting at 24. And I'm constantly shifting between these, and I've got custom settings so I can quickly do it just with a change of a dial. And I often actually use something called 4K crop, which I have on my camera. So my camera can shoot at 8K, and 4K crop is basically 8K but just cropped. So it is still fully 4K, but that means I'm basically shooting at double my focal length. So for this, I was shooting with this lens, and say I was at 400 millimeter, but if I'm shooting 4K crop, it then basically is like 800 millimeter, and then I can actually put on a teleconverter, which I use quite often. So I've got a 1.4 and a 2 times. So with the 1.4 teleconverter, I'm shooting at this focal length. And then if I'm shooting with the 2 times teleconverter, I'm at 1600 millimeter. Sometimes, especially with small animals, I do want to be shooting at the very maximum. And sometimes you're actually limited for how close you can be. So I was often using the 4K crop and the 2 times teleconverter. So I was shooting closer. If I do shoot at 1600, any tiny movement is like massive. So it's like an earthquake. So what I actually do, if I don't have a tripod, I actually use my knees. So I will be sitting on my bum, and then I will have my lens on my knees, and that will be my tripod. Certain situations, I will use whatever is around me. So a wooden post or a car or someone's shoulder. But if I do need to, I do use a tripod. So it does happen. Composition-wise, I have a few sort of ideas of how I want to compose a shot before I'm even there. In this situation, I've got the pumas walking this direction. So I'm trying to go for more of a central composition. So they're in the middle and they're walking this way, and then I've got some space here. That means if they start walking quicker or a bit slower, I can still react and get their face, because that's the main thing I want to photograph in this moment. Sometimes I will zoom out and actually get more of the whole area and then get the whole body. But in this situation, there's a lot of foliage, and you can see there's a lot in the foreground. There's quite a messy background. So being quite zoomed in just makes everyone focus on the subject. I love rule of thirds, which is where you basically have your subject, your bird or animal, in one of these corners, and that allows lots of negative space. And I often like to have my subject looking into the frame. So, for example, for this, they're walking into the frame, and then you've got all this sort of lovely negative space, which allows you to focus on the subject. The main thing with wildlife photography is just adapting quickly, understanding the cues, like just with these pumas, this puma is listening in this direction, this one is listening behind. So I'm understanding what my subject is doing, what it's trying to think, and then I can react to different situations. One last message I'd share is love nature, respect it, and you can have amazing moments like this. It doesn't just happen in remote locations or isolated places. You can have this with your local wildlife. You just gotta know a bit about it.